This member of the mushroom family, this fungus, is for the moment known only as X. It was discovered barely weeks ago growing in a remote rainforest. Science has not yet given it a name, for science knows scarcely anything about it. But it is felt that X might have one remarkable quality, that it stimulates extrasensory perception, enabling the mind to become telepathic and clairvoyant. Now that's a rather large claim. Is it true or false? The answer to that question took us on a unique and distant journey.
Have you ever had an experience that has fundamentally changed your worldview? An experience that has wrenched you completely from one mode of thinking and plopped you unceremoniously in another? For some people, it's a religious awakening. For others, it's the birth of their child. Many people change irrevocably when they find a community or a calling after a lifetime of aimlessness. For me, it was doing a whole bunch of psychedelic drugs. Classy, I know. Pretty much any way you look at it, the psychedelic experience has yet to be fully understood. Modern neuroscience is making leaps and bounds in discovering the biological and chemical processes at work when humans ingest these mind-altering substances, but the ins and outs of biochemistry seem laughably inadequate in describing, much less explaining, these experiences. It leaves many questions, the most persistent of which is, why? Why did hallucinogenic plants and fungi evolve to contain these extraordinary compounds? Why do we animals have profound mystical experiences when we ingest them? What are the implications of that metaphysically? Is it a communion with God or the gods? Is it a gateway to some sort of alternate dimension? Or is it a purely subjective adventure brought on by measurable chemical activity within our bodies, our own amazing minds boggling themselves? Well, there are as many answers to those questions as there are psychonauts. I have my own opinions, which at certain points in this video I'm going to inflict upon you, whether you like it or not. But of all the great minds who have attempted to parse the mysteries of the psychedelic experience, one stands prominently out: the late 20th century American ethnobotanist and mystic Terence McKenna. If you have any interest in psychedelics at all, chances are pretty high that you've come across a Terence McKenna lecture or quote at some point while combing through the internet, probably while fresh off the experience, trying to make sense of the whole thing. He has a lot of quippy sayings that have been turned into great memes. As an enthusiast of the early internet, Terence probably would have liked this very much, as well as hundreds of hours of wonderfully verbose and thought-provoking lectures that are freely available on YouTube, made all the more charming by his oddly magnetic, puckish whine.
Anyone who has actually been around people using psychedelics know they have tremendous therapeutic potential, tremendous potential to launch people into confrontations with aspects of their personality or their history that they are in denial of. The people who hold that these psychedelic substances have no application have very little actual personal experience with them. It's the old story of my mind is made up, don't confuse me with facts.
In any given Terence McKenna lecture, you will find a wealth of mind-bending insights, sage folk wisdom, razor-sharp wordplay, and raucous, mischievous humor. You will also find some of the ditziest, most insensate, deeply unserious, intellectually lazy, batshit crazy stoner pontification that you could possibly imagine. Ever heard of the stoned ape theory? The idea that early hominids eating psilocybin mushrooms kick-started human evolution? Well, Terence came up with that one, and as we'll talk about in a bit here, there's a lot wrong with it. Ever hear of the idea that the world was going to end in 2012 because of the Mayan calendar? Specifically, the theory that as novelty increased in human cultures and technologies, history would eventually climax in some sort of transcendent endpoint on December 21st of that year? Well, Terence came up with that one too. And while I immensely respect him having the balls to set a specific date for his millenarian prophecy, the fact remains that as of this recording, it is 2024, and history, much less the world, has not ended. Terence was wrong about these things, and many others, but he was wrong in an interesting and unique way, and that deserves exploration. Journalist Hamilton Morris pretty much summed up my feelings on Terence's theories when he said,
So many things that Terence McKenna said, it's both true and untrue. I think it's untrue in a literal sense, but very true in a poetic sense.
In that vein, I'd like to both appreciate and interrogate Terence's ideas. While this video will include a good deal of criticism and may come off to some of Terence's fans as rather square and hard-headed, I just want to make it clear right off the bat that I consider Terence McKenna to be a genuine genius. I have absolutely no patience at all for stubborn, snobby, sober normies who roll their eyes at Terence and write him off as a drug-addled New Age guru, without bothering to engage with his ideas and the revelations of entheogenic plants and fungi more generally. As far as I'm concerned, this is really disrespectful to people who have discerned profound spiritual meaning on psychedelics. This is not going to come off like a video essay by a Reddit atheist, constantly scoffing at every idea that doesn't strictly adhere to rationalistic materialism. That would kind of be like telling the story of Moses and constantly adding insulting addendums like, "He must have set that bush on fire when he was drunk." But I gotta say, I get super frustrated when I see psychonauts resorting to superstition, confirmation bias, and anti-intellectualism as they try to make sense of their experiences. And unfortunately, I see Terence as kind of the poster child for psychedelic magical thinking in that sense. I'll be straight with you guys. I am a hard-bitten materialist. When someone tells me they've seen a ghost, my first question is, where's the evidence? But I also take a phenomenological approach to life. If I see a ghost myself, I incorporate that into my worldview. And truly I tell you, brothers and sisters, I have seen ghosts. I've been to fractal realms made of light and sound. I've met and spoken to entities that were not human. You can't tell me I didn't go to those places and see those things. I was there. I was there. I know what I saw. And how did I do it? 5 dry grams in silent darkness. So I don't really like getting stoned. In fact, I've never once used any illegal substance of any kind or done anything illegal ever. But, if I did, then the following things may have happened to me. I smoked a lot of weed in college. I'm very unique in that way. But I didn't like it all that much, and I don't like it anymore. It makes me anxious. The first time that I met psilocybe cubensis, the magic mushroom, was when I was about 19 or 20. My first trip was in a cemetery at night, which could be great if you're intentionally going for a Mary Shelley kind of vibe, but we were not. We were there because we didn't have any better ideas. I'm a fairly neurotic, high-strung individual, so tripping while trespassing, allegedly trespassing, in a dark, scary, unfamiliar place was less than ideal. Thankfully, I had taken pissant amounts, so the experience wasn't too catastrophic, just generally disquieting. Failing to learn my lessons and generally being completely uneducated on the responsible use of these extremely powerful compounds, I took mushrooms a second time, not long after, and had some mild to moderate mental health issues come up, which was a bit scary, I'm not gonna lie. This is reason 1648, why set and setting are so crucially important. I'm a child of the late 90s and early 2000s. I had DARE classes at Wayland Middle School. A local cop named Officer 40 waddled into our classroom and told us to just say no, or something.
Drugs. Some of the big kids do them. But my mom and dad helped get this DARE anti-drug program in our school.
It's run by specially trained police.
Now we're saying no to drugs.
Maybe if we'd been adequately informed about the history and effects of various drugs, then I would have known that you should always take psychedelics in a safe and friendly environment with a sober trip sitter. And maybe I would have waited until I was a little older to start indulging them. Ironically, Terence McKenna would have been a much better DARE officer than Officer 40 was. His advice for the responsible use of entheogens has aged like wine. The first good trip I had was in the woods of Pennsylvania, possibly in proximity to a certain historic site, wearing certain historical clothing associated with that site. That was a funny fucking time. After that, I warmed up to the mushroom a bit, but I didn't have a psychedelic experience for quite a number of years after that. Every once in a while, somebody would offer me half a tab of LSD or a shriveled up little shroom at a Mardi Gras parade or something, but that's not a psychedelic experience. The mushroom won't talk to you if you're sweating whiskey ginger. The story continues in the summer of 2021, when my then girlfriend, now wife, and I went to this beautiful forested place, also quite historic as a matter of fact, and each took, I think, 150 micrograms of LSD. This was a very influential trip for me creatively. I don't know if any of y'all remember the sort of stuff that I was posting in the summer of 2021, but it wasn't normal. True story. 2 years later, we went to the same place and did it again. Twice in 1 week, actually. The first trip was psilocybin, assisted by DMT. I wrote a journal of that experience, which I will now go ahead and bore you with. We started tripping at around 4 p.m. and started hiking away from town toward the trails. We had tripped here before, and when we entered the woods, there was a profound sense of continuity, like returning to a meadow you loved as a child and delighting to find it unchanged. We stopped at every fallen log and ran our hands over the bark. It seemed like there were many layers of life over this rotting, dead thing. Moss, fungi, insects, what looked like an old snakeskin that had somehow fused to the face of the corpse tree. The layers pulsed madly, seemed to reconfigure into a mathematical grid, then resolve themselves into their original shape at about the speed of a slow heartbeat or a quick breath. 2 days later, we each took about 200 micrograms of acid and went back into the woods. This one was a truly jaw-dropping experience. I've never had trees look back at me before. I was fixated on fungi during this trip and stopped to gawk at every cap we passed by poking out of the undergrowth. Sadly for my wife, this has continued into my sober life for almost a year at this point. When we're walking the dog, I force my wife to stop at every mushroom we pass by so I can scan it on my Mycology for Dummies iPhone app to see what species it is and satisfy my curiosity. Inspired by Albert Hoffman, we rode bicycles down from the woods to the shore of a lake. It had rained a bit and the sun was out, and there were rainbows, more rainbows than I'd ever seen, more beautiful than any I'd ever seen. At this point, my wife went home, but I pressed on. These are some pictures that I took on that bike ride. The sun was going down. The lake was the same color of the sky. At one point, I watched a family of ducks pass in front of the sunset. And I have to say that was one of the most serene and contented moments of my entire life. Oh, and then for some reason I recorded this video.
I'm sorry, Andy can't come to the phone right now. His mind has been taken over by a fungus.
That week kickstarted an intense interest in psychedelics in a pretty serious way. And I kind of started having the idea that these compounds are essentially magic. And I know that's such a stoner thing to say, and I'm not suggesting that psychedelics can't be understood in terms of material processes, but you got to admit, their mere existence is extraordinary in the purest sense of the word. It's like we're in a fantasy novel, the premise of which is it's just like the normal real world, but there are these mushrooms that take people to another fucking dimension. It seems like there should be no place for these experiences in a rational, post-Enlightenment world. My next trip was a few months later, and it was with my old friend Psilocybe cubensis. Terence always said that the mushroom was the most transcendent of the psychedelics, and this is why I tend to agree. One autumn day in the early afternoon, I ate an indeterminate quantity of mushrooms. Rest assured, that was the very last time that I did that, and now avail myself of a scale. If I had to guess, I would say that I had eaten about 6 or 7 dry grams, which is an enormous amount, unless you have a tolerance for psilocybin, which I did not at the time. This was one of those trips where you think that you're peaking, only to quickly realize with a sinking sense of dread that you've barely even begun the come up. I'd been listening to a lot of Terence lectures leading up to this trip, And as I continued to come up and up and up and up and up and up and up at a dizzying speed, breaking through barriers I'd never even approached before, I realized that it might be a good time to see what all this self-transforming elf machine business was about. Terrence had insisted time and time again that you meet entities in the mushroom realm. And I understood very deeply that I was on the threshold of that realm, that if I was going to talk to God or anybody who was out there, it was going to happen now. So I went into my bedroom, I drew the blackout curtains, and turned off the lights. I punched through the dimensional membrane, an odd sensation that feels like falling, and with complete sincerity and openness, I said, "Hello? Anybody there?" Immediately, I was seized by visions of the life cycle of the mycelium. White threads spreading out over substrate, the pins popping up like acne, then swelling into phallic fruiting bodies whose caps unfold grotesquely to ejaculate a cloud of black spores. Then I was suspended in outer darkness, a space between spaces, and I saw this enormous, lumbering, galaxy-sized creature floating by me like a blimp. It was so huge, and I was so little in comparison, that it didn't acknowledge me, but I got caught up in its psychic wake as though I was a piece of litter getting rocked by a passing container ship. I felt myself getting possessed by this entity, almost demonically. The image that flashed through my mind was this creature's essence manifesting as a liquid and filling up all my blood vessels, which was a terrifying sensation, and then receding like a wave as it passed me by and finally disappeared into the blackness of interdimensional space. So yeah, that happened. I've since met entities again, including on one trip, which was 1 week ago as of this writing, where I was actually in full conversation with a being made of light in some sort of uterine mind palace, and which I'm still processing. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that communicating with non-human entities that in the moment I am 1000% convinced are materially real has forced me to examine the nature of reality from a new perspective. After each of these experiences, I sober up and think to myself, now look here, my good man. I know it felt real at the time, but what evidence, or even halfway good grounds for suspicion, do you have that this is all anything other than a chemical reaction in your brain? The simplest explanation usually being the best. Don't you think that when you talk to these entities, you're really just talking to yourself? And yeah, I can't really argue with that. But doesn't it also reek just ever so slightly of cope? A comforting reassurance because the alternative is simply unspeakable? Well, I don't know. I have to tell you, I really have no fucking idea. Mind-altering substances have been utilized throughout history by people all around the globe for various social, ritual, or religious purposes. The most notable in the Eastern Hemisphere being alcohol, and in the Western Hemisphere, tobacco. Entheogenic plants and fungi are likewise found worldwide, where they have played a subtler but no less important role in the mystical traditions of some indigenous and pre-modern cultures. Though psychedelic shamanism is most typically associated with the indigenous people of Central and South America, Northern Eurasia actually has quite a strong tradition of mushroom ecstasy. The fly agaric mushroom, which does not contain psilocybin but nonetheless can produce psychotropic effects, was historically consumed by indigenous Siberians, the Sami of northern Scandinavia, and possibly other pre-Christian European peoples such as the Norse. But for whatever reason, fungal teachers never really caught on in the religious traditions of Africa, Asia, Europe, or European colonized North America, and instead were relegated to the mystical fringe, the province of obscure and secretive tribal folkways. This could be due to the dominance of prophetic rather than shamanistic faiths in these regions. In prophetic religions, God comes down from on high to talk to you. In psychedelic shamanism, you take a substance that allows you to travel to the domain of the gods. A common theme across Eurasian monotheism is the restriction of access to mind-altering substances, most notably Islam's prohibition of alcohol. It could also be because psychedelia is egalitarian by nature. Anyone can take these substances and commune with the divine. The central idea of monotheistic theology strongly parallels authoritarian politics, and historically has often been consciously deployed by authoritarians as a tool for centralized control. Hierarchical agricultural societies with a monarchy and/or a powerful priestly class really have no cultural use for shamanism and the psychotropic plants and fungi which can facilitate it. In any case, it was in Mesoamerica and the Amazon basin where entheogenic cults truly thrived. Indigenous Mexican rituals involving consuming mushrooms from various species of the genus Psilocybe were briefly observed by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century, before being brutally repressed during the conquest. Spanish colonizers either exterminated or irrevocably transformed just about every indigenous cultural tradition in mainland Central and South America, but some lifeways proved remarkably resilient, including isolated mushroom cults in places like the Oaxaca Mountains and the western Amazon, which of course is also renowned for the ceremonial use of ayahuasca, a potion made from the vine of Banisteriopsis caapi, which contains high amounts of naturally occurring dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. These various religions successfully kept their secrets safe for 400 years. But in the mid-20th century, a strange new postmodern kind of colonizer appeared: the bioprospector. In 1955, following up on rumors and reports that Mazatec shamans in rural Mexico were obtaining powers of divination through the ceremonial consumption of mushrooms, R. Gordon Wasson and Valentina Wasson, an American married couple of amateur ethnomycologists, traveled to a small town in Oaxaca's Sierra Mazateca Mountains. There, they ate the fruits of the Psilocybe mexicana fungus and partook in a mushroom ceremony led by one Maria Sabina, a local healer and poet. Amazed by the experience, the Wassons collected Mexicana spores and brought them to Europe, where scientists were able to cultivate the fungus under artificial conditions. Unbeknownst to either the Wassons or Maria Sabina, the expedition to Oaxaca was clandestinely funded by the CIA's MKUltra program. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. 2 years later, R. Gordon Wasson published an article in Life magazine titled "Seeking the Magic Mushroom," telling the story of the Mexican expedition and the surreal, almost supernatural experience of his first shroom trip. The article reached an audience of millions all over the Western world and immediately captured the imagination of the counterculture. The only problem with this, other than the CIA connection, was that Sabina had only allowed the Wassons to partake in her ceremony after they had promised to keep the whole thing a secret. In the Life magazine article, Wasson initially referred to Sabina with a pseudonym, but in his follow-up book used her real name freely and published photos of her. This led to a wave of American bioprospecting to Oaxaca that continues to this day. Age-old Mazatec religious traditions were swiftly commodified and non-consensually appropriated. Meanwhile, in Europe, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, the inventor of LSD, isolated and synthesized psilocybin on behalf of the Sardas Pharmaceutical Company, which immediately patented Hoffman's extraction procedure and began selling psilocybin pills under a brand name. Among the Mazatec, Maria Sabina was widely blamed for this catastrophe. Shunned by her community, she was briefly jailed, her house was burned down, and she died in poverty. Dark stuff. But it would still be some time before magic mushrooms became widely available. The drug of choice during the psychedelic 60s was LSD, Albert Hofmann's problem child, as he famously put it. The mushroom remained relatively obscure and was primarily associated with pseudoscientific research into extrasensory perception, as shown in a fascinating 1961 episode of the TV show One Step Beyond.
Secret arrangements are made, and we are guided to this hidden place to wait. But it is almost midnight before the brujo appears. He has practiced the secret and all but forbidden rites of the sacred mushroom for decades. Our scientists have prepared test questions to evaluate the brujo's extrasensory perception. To achieve spiritual union, they also must eat the mushroom. And then, oddly enough, the first sound we hear as the chemical in the mushroom takes effect is laughter.
But that all changed in the spring of 1971, during the course of another fateful bioprospecting expedition to Latin America, where 5 early 20s hippies would find themselves at the crossroads between psychedelia, divine illumination, and plain old insanity. It's a story that reads like a collaboration between Werner Herzog and David Lynch, and it's related in lurid detail in a first-hand account by our very own Terence McKenna in his memoir, True Hallucinations. Terence was 24 years old in 1971. Born in 1946 in small-town Colorado and partially raised in the Bay Area of California, he enrolled in college at Berkeley in 1965, where he soon found himself fully swept up in the late 60s counterculture, in the very beating heart of Vietnam-era militant student activism. At Berkeley, Terence was a committed anti-war protester. A staunch Marxist, he fought the cops at the Berkeley protests alongside, he claims, affinity groups called the Persian Fuckers and the Acid Anarchists. Right on. Already a daily marijuana smoker, Terence soon began experimenting with acid, which helped fuel his longtime interest in philosophy, shamanism, and the occult. Early in 1967, the whole course of Terence's life changed when he had his first experience with DMT. He would repeatedly claim that this single experience completely shattered his faith in materialist reality. He became convinced that the drug was literally offering him a window into another dimension. As he recalled years later,
after one exposure to it, I said, this isn't a drug, this is magic. This is a dimension to reality that most people never even suppose exists.
DMT was incredibly rare in the United States in the late 60s, but Terence was determined to find more. Soon he had initiated his younger brother, Dennis McKenna, into the elf-haunted fractal halls of the DMT realm. Dennis quickly became a true believer as well, but both brothers were frustrated by the short duration of the trip. To fully plumb the DMT mysteries, they felt they needed to somehow extend the length of its effects. After spending the summer of love at Berkeley, lucky bastard, Terence got into some trouble with U.S. Customs for allegedly smuggling hashish. Fleeing the country, he spent much of 1969 and 1970 backpacking across South Asia, where he posed as a butterfly collector as he continued to seek out psychedelic experiences of increasing intensity. Curious to see if the magic of psychedelia was comparable to more traditional mystical experiences, he searched for meaning among the spiritual practices of India, but was left disappointed. In his words, he approached people of spiritual accomplishment with the question, "What can you show me?" and received only, quote, old man wisdom. Having long since rejected the Catholicism of his youth, Terence began to believe that psychedelics, and DMT in particular, represented the only reliable method for communion with the divine. After an eventful jaunt in Indonesia, where he was very nearly recruited into an ethnobotanical expedition by a former Nazi with the absurd name of Dr. Karl Heinz, he made his way to Vancouver, where he lived for 3 months with 2 other hippies from Berkeley, Vanessa, an activist, and Dave, a drifter, both New Yorkers. Together, they began to make plans with Dennis, who was at home in Colorado, to travel to the Amazon rainforest to find a longer-lasting, orally active form of DMT rumored to be among the indigenous people there. In October 1970, Terence and Dennis's mother passed away from cancer. Still unable to return to the States for fear of criminal prosecution, Terence lost his chance to say goodbye. He was reeling from the loss, but still continued on with his travel plans. And early in 1971, Terence, Dennis, Dave, and Vanessa flew down to Bogota to embark on a bioprospecting expedition which would prove to be the most significant in psychedelic history. The object of the quest was a concoction called ukuhe, an ayahuasca-like substance used by the Witoto people indigenous to the La Chorrera municipality of southern Colombia. None of our 4 adventurers could speak a lick of Spanish, so it was highly fortuitous that upon their arrival in South America, they met and befriended Ev, another young Yankee hippie, who tagged along on the expedition as their translator. After days of arduous downriver travel through an increasingly remote landscape of steaming Amazonian jungle, a priest with a speedboat carried the hippies to an isolated portage, which led to a trail. A 4.5-day hike later, they found themselves in the central village of La Chorrera. A small mission town, La Chorrera's demographics in the early 70s consisted of a few Spanish-speaking priests and a majority indigenous population of subsistence farmers. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the town had been the base of operations for the Peruvian Amazon Company, a rubber corporation which conducted slave raids into the surrounding jungle, forcing the captives to harvest rubber trees en masse in appalling conditions. Indigenous people who resisted were tortured, raped, and murdered. According to the locals Terence encountered on his journey, this for-profit genocide had reduced the Witoto population from 40,000 down to 5,000. In True Hallucinations, Terence lingers on this grisly history, and even relates in detail his encounter with a notorious Barbadian corporate enforcer who helped commit these atrocities, by then hobbled and old, having never been brought to justice for his crimes. But Terence also seems blissfully unaware of the colonial adventurism inherent to his rendering of the tale. At times it reads like Robinson Crusoe. He portrays himself and his companions as explorers of unknown frontiers, both psychic and geographic. This is a pursuit of knowledge, yeah, but it's more romantic than it is empirical, more akin to Magellan than Darwin. And soon enough, the human locals are quickly forgotten, and La Chorrera's fungal denizens take center stage. A day after their arrival, Dave was exploring the cow pasture behind the house where they were staying. There, he found an enormous number of cow pies, and out of each pile of dung sprouted a flush of juicy golden mushrooms. Terence and Dennis quickly identified the species as Psilocybe cubensis, the pantropical fungus most commonly found growing in bovine feces. That night, each member of the party consumed 6 of these mushrooms, having really no good idea of appropriate psilocybin dosage. Terence recorded his thoughts about his first high-dose mushroom trip in his journal the next day.
Multifaceted and benevolent, as complex as mescaline, as intense as LSD, the mushroom, as it is said of peyote, teaches the right way to live. This particular mushroom species is unclaimed, as far as I know, by any Aboriginal people anywhere, and thus is neutral ground for the tryptamine dimension we are exploring. Through this unclaimed vegetable teacher, one can gain entry into the world of the elf chemists. This mushroom is a trans-dimensional doorway which sly fairies have left slightly ajar for anyone to enter into who can find the key and wishes to use this power, the power of vision, to explore this peculiar and naturally occurring psychoactive complex.
For Terence and the mushroom, it was love at first sight. The quest for ukuhe was quickly forgotten as the hippies plumbed deeper into the mysteries of these queer, yellow-capped dung lovers. They began to take heroic doses of psilocybin almost daily. With a fewer variety of food options than they were used to in the States, they started regularly throwing freshly plucked mushrooms into their soups and rice bowls. What could go wrong? Days turned to weeks. Terence began to feel like the group was on the verge of some sort of preternatural contact with a capital O other. During a trip one night, Dennis entered a strange catatonic state and began involuntarily emitting a loud buzzing sound, giving the distinct impression of a man possessed. When he had snapped out of the trance, he was highly alarmed and excited. He claimed that the sound had generated some sort of physical force. Dennis, Terence, and Ev were utterly convinced that the sound had supernatural origins. Vanessa and Dave were more skeptical. Discussing the experience during the following days, Terence seized upon some rumors he had once heard that in other parts of the Amazon, shamans on ayahuasca had the ability to vomit a magical substance, which he refers to as a psychofluid, which could be used for purposes of divination. Terence conceived of this as a material manifestation of the reality of the psychedelic experience. Perhaps this otherworldly vocalization could achieve the same function if focused directly. Dennis feverishly expounded on the idea in his own journal.
On tryptamines, it is possible, under special conditions, to hear and vocalize a sound that turns through a higher dimensional manifold and condenses as translinguistic matter, i.e. matter reduplicated upon itself through time, much as a hologram is reduplicated through space. The substance whose appearance the sound initiates is tryptamine, metabolized by mind through a higher spatial dimension. It is a hyperdimensional molecule carrying its trip on the outside of itself in this world. The hyperdimensional nature of this material is such that it is all material, concepts, events, words, people, and ideas, homogenized into one thing via the higher dimensional alchemy of mind.
Eager to test this theory, stay with me here, Dennis made preparations for what he called the experiment, an attempt to vocalize at a living cubensis mycelium in order to bond their human DNA to the fungus's DNA, uniting them in a higher dimension. And here's where things start to get a little unclear. This would essentially usher in the millennium, as the human soul was reunited with its uterine divine source. According to Terence, Dennis had already used the voice in order to generate a freezing cold wind in the steaming jungle, which had completely convinced him that this phenomenon had the power to break the laws of physics. Dave and Vanessa remained unmoved by this evidence and began to become seriously concerned about the mental health of their companions. On the night of the experiment, March 4th, 1971, there was a sudden and violent thunderstorm. Shouting over the wind, Dennis declared to his companions that it was a sign that they would succeed. Terrence here notes that his little brother was beginning to remind him of Captain Ahab. Dave sank to his knees at that moment with a pitiful moan as the rain beat down upon him, like a awestruck Roman centurion prostrating himself before the crucified Christ. Late that night, surrounded by moonless dark, the three true believers, Terrence, Dennis, and Ev, brought a mycelium into the hut and gathered around it. They ate mushrooms and drank ayahuasca, then used the voice 3 times. The vocalizations became louder and longer each time, and after the third, there was dead silence, broken only occasionally by the crowing of the cock from the nearby mission. More biblical imagery. Then Dennis leaned forward. "Look," he said breathlessly, and Terrence could see a glowing planet in place of where one of the mushrooms had been. "It is our world," Dennis proclaimed. "We have succeeded." Dennis was convinced that he was shamanically initiated. He began to behave like an Old Testament prophet, performing miracles, talking to the dead, including, heartbreakingly, their recently deceased mother, and making proclamations as revealed to him by the divine. Recalling the events years later, he says that he felt like he was being stretched across the entire universe. Terrence was convinced that the apocalypse was upon them. As he writes,
"The voice of the mushroom spoke in my mind. You found it. This is it. It's all over now. There is no more. Within a few hours, the superstructure of earthbound human civilization is going to collapse, and your species will depart. First you will go to Jupiter, and then to Alpha in Sagittarius. A day of high adventure dawns at last for human beings."
After the experiment, even Ev began to grow distant from the brothers. Most of the party was now convinced that one or both of the McKennas had suffered a psychotic break, and a serious crisis was on their hands. Days later, Dennis was only marginally recovered from his state of religious ecstasy. Terrence stopped sleeping so he could watch over his little brother. He didn't sleep for 9 days. According to Dennis, at this point, Vanessa and Dave were begging Terrence to call in a float plane and get Dennis first home to America and then to a psychiatric hospital. But Terrence held them off. "It's okay," he tried to assure them. "Let's just see how this plays out." Dennis continued to perform miracles. One day he quoted word for word a conversation Terrence had had with a friend in Nepal that he was not present for. On another, he produced a long-lost key to a lockbox that once belonged to their grandfather. Terrence and Ev started seeing strange aerial phenomena. Inky black clouds took the shape of mushrooms, and one gray dawn, a flying saucer pulsing with orange and blue light flew low over the river. This sighting seemed especially significant, since both Dennis and Terrence had earlier reported seeing visions of alien starships and feeling like they were being watched from something floating in Earth's orbit directly above the Amazon. Finally, on March 15th, thanks largely to Vanessa's frantic efforts, a float plane arrived to pick the hippies up from La Chorrera. During the journey north to Bogota, Dennis was quiet and seemed weakened. Sobriety slowly but surely reasserted itself. The world had not ended. Yet. The relationships of the party were strained. It seemed like everyone but Terrence just wanted to put the whole surreal experience behind them. Back in Berkeley the following month, Terrence found himself in a grip of creative mania as he attempted to make sense of what had happened to them. Deciding that he needed expert help, he made an appointment to see Dr. Gunther Stent, a molecular geneticist and professor at Berkeley. Sitting down in the renowned scientist's office, Terrence laid out the ideas behind the experiment at La Chorrera. As his diatribe veered into all its bizarre dimensions, Terrence sensed that Stent was, quote, calculating the odds of whether I would physically attack him. Finally, Terrence asked him point blank, do these theories have any validity, or is it simply fallacious? Stent rose from the desk and sat by Terrence. With a sigh of resignation, he said, my dear young friend, these ideas are not even fallacious. So what happened at La Chorrera? Were all these wonders simply the result of 5 hippies tripping balls? Well, the short answer is yes. For the long answer, here's Dennis McKenna himself in a podcast interview from 2023.
Most of the information that was transmitted to us in this prolonged altered state subsequently, and especially from the perspective of now, I'm 73, right? So 53 years later, I understand that most of this was bunk, there were a few flashes of insight, but not at the time, We had various expectations about what the results of that experiment were going to look like, what the outcome was supposed to look like. None of that happened because it couldn't happen. It would have violated every law, every known law of physics, and collapsed the space-time continuum in the process. Space-time continuum proved to be quite resilient. We, not so much. And in fact, we both underwent prolonged, what some people would say was a psychosis. And it certainly had elements of that. It had elements of alien abduction experiences, and it had elements of shamanic initiation.
Partially inspired by the experiences at La Chorrera, Dennis pursued a career in botanical sciences and is today a noted ethnopharmacologist. While Terence never quite gave up the dream that something of enormous cosmic importance had occurred there in the Colombian jungle in March 1971, Dennis now credits a more psychological and interpersonal explanation. Two young brothers, devastated by their mother's recent death, both with lifelong interests in science fiction and inspired by their father's penchant for Fate magazine, a pulp periodical from the 50s which ran stories about ghosts, aliens, and strange, unexpected phenomena, including, incidentally, one issue which spotlighted the mushroom cults of Latin America. In short, the McKennas went into the Amazon rainforest, a place that is not exactly known to be kind to the mental health of outsiders, ingested an ungodly amount of psilocybin over an insanely long period of time, and saw what they wanted to see. But while the mushroom-crazed shamanic initiation of these reckless young hippies makes for a rip-roaring tale, it is a mere footnote in terms of the La Chorrera expedition's historical importance. Because the McKennas returned to the United States with the spores of Psilocybe cubensis, and over the following 4 years, they would attempt to cultivate the fungus in artificial conditions. It was arduous work, and progress was slow. But one day, in 1975, Terence returned to his house from a walk and absent-mindedly decided to check in on some neglected mushroom tubs in his greenhouse. He opened the door and, quote,
There they were, by the dozens, by the hundreds, huge picture-perfect specimens of psilocybe. I was neck-deep in alchemical gold. The elf legions of hyperspace had ridden to my rescue again. I was saved. As I knelt to examine specimen after perfect specimen, tears of joy streamed down my face. Then I knew the compact was still unbroken. The greatest adventure still lay ahead.
Terence and Dennis anonymously co-authored a book the following year called The Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, which gave step-by-step details for how cubensis fungi could be cultivated at home. Knowledge of the magic mushroom exploded across the English-speaking world. Hitching a ride on its human symbiote, Psilocybe cubensis spread out from the equator to thrive clandestinely in closets and garages all over the developed world, and became the common entheogen we know and love today. The United States government has idiotically classified fungi of the Psilocybe genus as a Schedule I drug, meaning that in most municipalities of this fair land, possession of any quantity of these mushrooms can land you in prison for years. This is despite the fact that many Psilocybe species, including cubensis, naturally occur in biomes across the country. Interestingly, the possession of cubensis spores, which contain no psilocybin, is legal in every state except California, Idaho, and Georgia. There are lots of reputable spore companies where you can actually order spores online for microscopy purposes, or really any purpose you want other than inoculating grain spawn. Now, viewed soberly, it's easy to laugh and dismiss the McKenna's exploits as drugged-up nonsense. And sure, when heard second or third hand, it seems like gibberish. But the lived experience of psychedelia is harder to dismiss. Clearly, these compounds are powerful and meaningful, and impart genuine spiritual significance to many people. It seems to me that the McKennas definitely suffered from mental health issues at La Chorrera. and the ability of psychedelics to, in rare instances, trigger serious psychotic events is well attested. But the critical factor here was that these hippies were taking psilocybin extremely irresponsibly. They were like kids playing with their father's gun, dangerously overindulging in mushrooms and ayahuasca at an extremely emotionally fraught period in their lives.
I'm the wrath of God. Who else is with me?
But using entheogens to achieve shamanic ecstasy, which I believe the party genuinely did, is nothing to wave your finger at. It's a practice that may be as old or older than our species. In fact, it may have inspired the very idea of human spirituality itself. The timeline of our history bifurcates now to two epochs of darkness and despair. The primeval African wastes of 1 million years before present, and the George H.W. Bush administration. 20 years after the experiment at La Chorrera, Terence was in his early 40s and married to, though soon to be divorced from, noted ethnobotanist Kathleen Harrison. The couple had founded a botanical preserve in Hawaii together back in the mid-'80s, and Terence had leveraged his countercultural clout and formidable talents for storytelling into a successful career as a public speaker, giving talks on history, science, politics, and philosophy through the lens of psychedelic revelation. It was by this time that his metaphysical worldview had more or less reached maturity, and he began publishing books advancing the theories for which he is now most famous. The most notorious of these volumes, published in 1992, is Food of the Gods, The Origin of the Stoned Ape Theory. In a talk he gave later that year, Terence explained his intention in writing the book.
Food of the Gods was deliberately designed as a kind of Trojan horse. It is something left on the doorstep of anthropology, a foundling, as it were. And when they open the door, they will find this thing on their doorstep and hopefully take it inside, and then discover too late that the elf machines of hyperspace, like Greek militiamen, are inside, ready to pour out and take over the bastions of human emergence theory.
While I'll be laying out the fine points of this theory in detail, I want to make it very clear from the beginning that, by his own admission, Terence is starting with a hypothesis conceived in states of mystical ecstasy and working backward to find evidence to support it. And as for the efficacy of his attempt to sneak this Trojan horse through the gates of academia, I'm afraid that Terence rolled a 1 on his stealth check. By page 12, he's already showing his hand.
Consider a shaman who uses plants to converse with an invisible world inhabited by non-human intelligences. We tend to assume that the shaman interprets his experience of intoxication as communication with spirits or ancestors. The implication is that you or I would interpret this experience differently, and that it is therefore no big deal that some poor, uneducated campesino thought he was talking with an angel. Xenophobic as this attitude is, it suggests a good operating procedure, since what it is saying is, show me the techniques of your ecstasy, and I will judge their effectiveness for myself. I did this. This is my credential for the theories and opinions I hold. I was initially appalled at what I found. The world of shamanism is far more real than the constructs of science can ever be.
I'm not gonna lie, if I was making a video about human evolution and picked up this book for research, then as soon as I came across this paragraph, I would stop reading then and there. Not because I'm closed-minded to this idea metaphysically, but because unfalsifiable and subjective notions of religious faith, which is essentially what this boils down to, is not a useful tool in evidence-based disciplines like history and the sciences. But thankfully, I'm not making a video about human evolution. I'm making a video about the strange and wonderful mind of Terence McKenna. So let's dive deeper into what Terence thinks our hominid ancestors were up to in Africa during the Paleolithic. Imagine, if you will, a family of early humans scavenging on an endless scrubland. They're following a herd of aurochs, waiting for some old or sick ones to die so they can eat their corpses. The aurochs leave huge piles of dung behind them on the trail, and out of the pies sprout thick, blue bruised, golden-capped mushrooms. The humans are hungry. Maybe these mushrooms will tide them over until they can find a fruit tree or a dead body somewhere. They eat their fill, and then... as psilocin courses through their brains, the humans begin to have thoughts unrelated to their immediate needs of feeding, survival, and reproduction. They begin to think abstractly about themselves and the world around them. They hear voices that aren't there. Plants and animals take on strange and terrifying shapes. The night sky shines with stars, and for the first time they begin to wonder what those lights in the sky actually are. Terence's thesis is essentially this.
My contention is that mutation-causing psychoactive chemical compounds in the early human diet directly influenced the rapid reorganization of the brain's information processing capabilities. Alkaloids in plants, specifically the hallucinogenic compounds such as psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and harmaline, could be the chemical factors in the proto-human diet that catalyze the emergence of self-reflection.
I think the operative word here is could. And Terence is absolutely right. This definitely could have happened deep in our species' prehistoric past. Again, psychoactive plants and fungi can be found all over the world. Psilocybe cubensis is a pan-tropical species, and it's very likely it was all over Africa in the Paleolithic. This is a fascinating hypothesis, but to become a viable theory, it requires evidence. What hard evidence does Terence supply to support his contention? Well, he draws on 20th century studies of the effects of psilocybin to stimulate the human brain, and archaeological evidence of cow bones found in proximity to human graves. That's pretty much it. The rest is pure supposition. What little evidence Terence has is pretty circumstantial, and that's being quite generous. I would be impressed if we found the remains of even one early human in Africa with traces of psilocin in their body, but I don't even think that's possible. I mean, that compound doesn't last that long. One important aspect of the stoned ape theory that many of its critics often get wrong is that Terence was not suggesting that exposure to psilocybin changed humans physiologically. He believes that ritual mushroom eating was instead a long-lasting religious practice that became widespread among early humans in Africa. As he writes,
the relationship between human and mushroom is probably altogether no more than 1 million years old, for the era of the nomadic human hunter dates from that time. The last 100,000 years is probably a more than generous amount of time. We are not discussing a biological symbiosis that might take many millions of years to evolve. Rather, we are talking about a deep-rooted custom, an extremely powerful natural habit.
Okay, but 100,000 years is a ridiculously long period of time for any culture to do any one thing, especially when you consider the climatological catastrophes which afflicted and depopulated early humans throughout this period. I find it very hard to believe that any human cultural practice could last that long under any circumstance. And again, where is the evidence? At the end of the day, this is unfalsifiable. Terence's explanation for the extraordinarily long endurance of his hypothetical prehistoric mushroom cult hinges on his beliefs about the metaphysical purpose of entheogens themselves. He posits that psychedelic compounds are exopheromones, chemical messengers that impart information across species lines, essentially a way for Mother Earth to talk to herself. Though this slightly contradicts some of Terence's other beliefs about the nature of the mushroom, which we'll get to later. In Food of the Gods, he contends that mushroom ecstasy provided an umbilicus to the mind of the planet, which imparted a divinely inspired Gaian theology to early humans consisting essentially of egalitarian, pacifistic eco-anarchism, a way of living that he describes as being in dynamic equilibrium with nature, other humans, and an individual's sense of self.
The notion of nature as an organismic and planetary whole that mediates and controls its own development through the release of chemical messages may seem somewhat radical. Our heritage from the 19th century is a nature all tooth and claw, where a pitiless and mindless natural order promotes survival of those capable of ensuring their own existence at the expense of competitors. Yet most evolutionary biologists have long held this classical Darwinian view to be incomplete. It is now generally understood that nature, far from being endless warfare among the species, is an endless dance of diplomacy.
I actually couldn't agree more. In terms of my own metaphysical beliefs and moral philosophy, I find the idea of survival of the fittest to be a deeply repugnant one, born out of profound pessimism about the workings of nature. I think there's a very good reason. Social Darwinism is the intellectual underpinning of fascism. It's a misanthropic and harmful view that enshrines might makes right as the objective morality of the universe. Yeah, species compete to survive, but they also cooperate. Ecology is a balance, just as much, if not more so, than it is a battle. And the very existence of affection and kindness in social animals proves that empathy is evolutionarily advantageous. Really, this comes down to how you choose to look at the workings of nature. Personally, I think life is a fucking miracle. But, you know, if you're a self-hating, glass-half-empty, miserable bastard, then you might take the Herzogian view.
The trees here are in misery and the birds are in misery. I don't think they sing, they just screech in pain.
I also think that the idea of our planet's biomass being, in effect, a single self-regulating organism is a beautiful and highly compelling one. It's a revelation I've experienced on my own mushroom trips, and it genuinely informs how I live my life. But again, my spiritual beliefs and Terrence's spiritual beliefs, deeply held as they may be, are not really relevant to this conversation. And if we are taking Food of the Gods seriously as an academic work, as Terrence intended, then we can't accept his or my subjective mystical experiences as empirical evidence. So I am as yet unconvinced that psilocybin played any role in the formative development of the modern human mind. What I think is very possible, however, even likely, is that the ingestion of entheogenic mushrooms either inspired or enhanced some of the very first religious beliefs in human history. Terrence lays out a hypothetical scenario of how psilocybin could have transformed an early human tribal culture, based on 3 levels of dosage. Number 1, the microdose. Citing the research of Hungarian psychopharmacologist Roland Fischer, Terrence suggests that early human hunter-gatherers consuming small amounts of psilocybe mushrooms while in the general act of browsing for food experienced the increased visual acuity that is sometimes reported by people who take psilocybin at sub-perpetual doses, what is commonly referred to as a microdose. This may have increased the human's scavenging productivity and led to a food surplus and better health outcomes within their tribe. Number 2, the moderate dose. Terrence claims that middling doses increased restlessness and sexual arousal, which may have increased the tribe's reproductive success, and that the lowered inhibitions of these stoned apes led to more sexual experimentation, such as group sex, polyamory, and homosexuality. He argues that non-monogamous, non-reproductive, and orgiastic sex strengthened social cohesion and discouraged patriarchy, and since male parentage could not be easily traced, tribes of the mushroom cult raised children collectively. Number 3, the heroic dose. At large doses, psilocybin triggered full-blown mystical experiences, the sheer supernatural power of which forced early humans to think abstractly and metaphysically. This stimulated the development of shamanistic religion, the creation of art, and the need for a language complex enough to be able to communicate non-literal concepts. The implication here being that fundamental elements of our very humanness came about as a direct result of mushroom-induced shamanic ecstasy. This is a very neat hypothesis, but I have some problems with it. First of all, I want to take a moment to appreciate just how ahead of his time Terrence was with the suggestion that microdosing psilocybin could be beneficial at all. Remember, he's writing during the absolute height of the war on drugs, at a time when scientific research of entheogens was stymied for decades due to draconian governmental policies. In the 30 years since Food of the Gods was published, we've seen an enormous amount of anecdotal evidence to suggest that microdosing, i.e. consuming between 0.1 and 0.5 dry grams of mushrooms, has various benefits to mental well-being and cognitive function. That said, there haven't been nearly enough placebo-controlled studies to confirm these reports with any kind of certainty, and some of our most recent data is not encouraging. A 2022 Argentinian study, which measured the effects of microdosing on 34 individuals over a 9-month period, found that there was a negligible difference in cognitive ability between participants on psilocybin and those on a placebo. And while psilocybin produced significant subjective effects on the participants, it also generally induced impaired performance on cognitive tests. The idea that psilocybin increases visual acuity seems to fit pretty firmly under the umbrella of subjective effects, and saying that this is a reliable effect that all or even most humans experience is a huge stretch. What we can say for sure, however, is that psilocybin's active metabolite psilocin stimulates the brain's serotonin receptors. One reliable effect of microdosing that we have measured is improved mood. And people who are in a good mood generally perform tasks with more rigor and creativity than people in a bad mood. As far as increased sexual arousal, same thing. That effect is subjective and can't be said to reliably happen to everyone. Like with alcohol, I think the effect of psilocin to increase serotonin may increase arousal in some people, but intoxication at even moderate doses would more often than not handicap sexual performance, which, is the important thing when you're trying to have a good time. I also think Terence is projecting his own late 60s vision of Edenic utopia on this hypothetical mushroom cult. At Berkeley, Terence was an enthusiastic participant in the rolling orgies of the Summer of Love, at a crucial moment in the history of sexuality, when a major wave of sex positivity and sexual liberation swept across American culture for the very first time. This clearly made an impact on him, and I think this part of the hypothesis comes more from his own cultural bias than it does any kind of anthropological guesswork. Now, the third part of this conjecture, heroic doses bringing on culture-changing mystical experiences, I take much more seriously. Though a lot of Terence's reasoning relies on now outdated neuroscience and some of his own mystical beliefs about the supernatural power of language, research done in the so-called psychedelic renaissance of the past 10 or 15 years has revealed that high-dose mushroom trips can have extraordinary long-term effects, such as increased thoughtfulness, a greater capacity for empathy, lowered levels of anxiety, and, as I can personally attest, a changed philosophical outlook. It seems completely reasonable to me to suggest that ritual mushroom use in Paleolithic Africa represented an early, if not wholly original, attempt by humanity to not only grapple with the mysteries of the divine, but to create an organized, artistic, and political society with abstract goals separate from immediate material concerns. However, for the 47th time, this is completely unfalsifiable. Terence offers no hard evidence to support this claim, and in fact, sort of lets his imagination run away with him by ascribing specific cultural traits to the mushroom cult, which he believes is the ur-religion of humanity. He describes them as a matriarchal culture, worshipping a great horned goddess, a deity synergized from a feminine conception of nature or the earth, and masculine imagery from the cows in whose droppings the divine fungus grows. As he writes,
I believe that the natural psychedelic compounds acted as feminizing agents that tempered and civilized the egocentric values of the solitary hunter individual with the feminine concerns for child rearing and group survival. The prolonged and repeated exposure to the psychedelic experience, the wholly other rupture of the mundane plane caused by the hallucinogenic ritual ecstasy, acted steadily to dissolve that portion of the psyche which we moderns call the ego.
As Food of the Gods moves from the Paleolithic into the Neolithic, Terence's grand gendered theory of history emerges. He contrasts two competing modes of human society: the partnership model, which is feminine, nature-based, shamanistic or polytheistic, sex-positive, pacifistic, collectivistic, and magical, and the dominator model, which is masculine, property-based, authoritarian, often monotheistic, sexually repressive, hierarchical, chauvinistic, and coldly rational. Terence posits that 20th century Western civilization is the culmination of 2,000 years of supremacy by the dominator model, ushered into prominence by the patriarchal cult of Christianity, which he poetically represents with the mythical death of the great god Pan, and reaching its apex with the industrial rape of planet Earth by the forces of scientific capitalism. The Paleolithic mushroom cult of the Great Horned Goddess is the ultimate expression of the partnership model, the Edenic womb of humanity that us postmoderns must crawl back into in order to cure our cultural neuroses. Terence traces the religious legacy of the cult of the Great Horned Goddess through the Neolithic, supporting his conjecture by pointing to the famous rock paintings of Tassili un Angir in southern Algeria. The art not only depicts cows and a pastoral lifestyle, a sure sign of the presence of our coprophilic, i.e. shit-eating, friend Psilocybe cubensis, but also what appear to be mushroom-headed humans running or dancing, grasping mushrooms in their hands, and, most strikingly, the figure popularly referred to as Bee-Man, an insect-headed humanoid with mushrooms actually sprouting from his body. That's some Cronenberg shit, man. I'm into it. It has to be said. Isn't there something undeniably psychedelic about these images? Don't these spotted, abstract forms call to mind the pulsing, self-transforming palaces of the DMT realm? I think so. While I wouldn't say with 100% certainty that this art is evidence of a psilocybin mushroom cult, the fact is, as much as these protrusions look like mushrooms, they could also be all sorts of other things. I do think it's almost certain. I'm in complete agreement with Terence here. Where he loses me is when he tries to retroactively apply his partnership model to this culture and various successive ones. Terence assumes that since the Bee-Man culture was taking mushrooms, then they must have 1. Gained insight into the psychedelic hyperspatial dimension which objectively exists and which everyone who uses entheogens shamanistically can access, and 2. That this led them to the same existential, religious, and political conclusions that he has come to. I don't believe that there is an objective psychedelic experience. I think these plants and fungi affect human minds in similar ways because everyone in our species is biologically and genetically nearly identical. I will also passionately defend psychedelics for use in medicine, both for the mind and the spirit, and there are mountains of evidence to suggest that when done right, these are positive and helpful experiences for most people. But the fact is, there are all sorts of shitty people who have taken psychedelics and remained just as horrible and shitty after their trip as they were before it. Sometimes psychedelics can even inspire shitty people to double down on their shittiness, with disastrous results. I don't think it's by any means a foregone conclusion that a mushroom cult would adapt the partnership model and not the dominator model. It could have also been a theocratic nightmare where a priestly ruling class hoarded the mushrooms for themselves and based tribal policy on insane superstitions that came to them when they were stoned out of their fucking minds. It could have been the Neolithic Heaven's Gate for all we know. Terence believes that the Tassili mushroom cult was both spiritually and technologically advanced compared to contemporary cultures in North Africa and the Middle East. He posits that as the Sahara dried up, the cult moved eastward to the Nile Valley and Palestine, where they progenitated the proto-agricultural technologies of the Natufian culture, possibly the world's oldest sedentary society. To back this claim up, he relies on his training as an art historian to trace an African artistic influence on Fertile Crescent pottery during this period. He argues that the civilizational culmination of the Tassili partnership culture as it moved into West Asia was the Neolithic settlement of Çatalhöyük in southern Anatolia, which at the time Food of the Gods was published seemed radically advanced compared to contemporary settlements in the region. Though Terence doesn't think that the custom of ritual mushroom use survived the migration from Africa, for him, the apparent lack of hierarchy, frequent artistic motif of bovines, and relative social complexity of Çatalhöyük are all indications that its people worshipped the Great Horned Goddess. However, since Food of the Gods was published, similar sites in Anatolia have also been found and studied, such as, of course, the famous ruins of Göbekli Tepe. Our current understanding is that the Çatalhöyük site is not terribly unique for its time and place. The more we discover about the Neolithic Middle East, the more it seems that the transition to sedentary agriculture was older and lasted longer than was previously thought. It doesn't seem like the origin of the transition can be traced to any one culture, so the connections Terence is making here seem a little bit tenuous. If he were alive today, Terence may very well have seen the mark of the psychedelic Great Goddess religion in sites like Göbekli Tepe as well. But even so, his argument largely hinges on the frequent appearance of cows in Çatalhöyük's artwork. Personally, I don't think it's that remarkable that a human culture on the forefront of the emerging eugenics of animal husbandry would be thinking about cows a lot. Terence suggests the Çatalhöyük culture was destroyed by chariot-riding Indo-Europeans from the Caucasus, early adopters of the dominator model. Hierarchical dominator cultures also sprang up in dynastic Egypt and the city-states of Sumer, ruled by patriarchal god-kings. Entheogens were dethroned by that most agricultural of drugs, BOOZE. As Terence Riley remarks,
no greater shift of social values is possible to imagine than that which would accompany the gradual changeover of a psilocybin cult to an alcohol cult.
But all was not lost. Refugees from Anatolia, he thinks, then migrated west to Crete, where the partnership model retained a tenuous foothold. There, vestiges of the Edenic mushroom religion influenced the Minoan culture, then the Mycenaean, then classical Greece, where it reached its, quote, latest and most baroque adumbrations, fucking love this guy, in the famed Mysteries of Eleusis. The Eleusinian Mysteries was a religious festival held at a holy site near Athens over a period of more than 2,000 years, where participants performed a series of rites celebrating and symbolically reenacting the goddess Persephone's annual journey to the underworld. Terence is correct to say that the Eleusinian Mysteries are extremely ancient, and that they likely originated with the Cretan cult of Demeter, Persephone's mom. It's a very flimsy piece of string that connects all this more than halfway around the Mediterranean, over 8,000 years back to Algeria and B-Man, but otherwise, so far so good. What exactly went on during these mysteries is not well understood. The priests who ran the festival did an excellent job keeping the various details of the rites a secret. But it does seem that at the climax of one important initiation, worshippers broke along fast by ingesting a potion called kykeon. They were then ushered into a huge temple called the Telestrion, which sounds like a robot from Fallout, where they experienced profound mystical visions while performing an elaborate ceremony representing the triumph over death. I'll give you 3 guesses what Terence thinks was in that kykeon. He actually suggests 2 theories. The first, put forward by R. Gordon Wasson and Albert Hoffman, was that kykeon was ergotized beer. The ergot fungus of the genus Claviceps grows on cereal grains and is of course the natural source of lysergic acid diethylamide. I think this theory is pretty silly. Since the 1960s, ergot has been retroactively blamed for all sorts of historical fiascos. I see it all the time in comment sections under my videos about the Salem witch trials. They were all tripping balls because they ate bad grain, and I gotta tell y'all who have been saying this, you need to talk to your dealer, maybe find a new one because you are getting bad acid. LSD is synthesized from ergot. It's a lab-made substance. It's not in ergot the same way psilocybin is in cubensis. If you eat ergot, you won't see God, you'll shit your pants and die. It's highly toxic. Yes, ergot poisoning does sometimes cause hallucinations, but they're more feverish than psychedelic. The second theory is from Robert Graves, the author of I, Claudius, who suggested in a 1964 essay that an entheogenic mushroom may have been the psychotropic ingredient in the kykeon. Though this is theoretically possible, psilocybe semilanceata, commonly called the Liberty Cap mushroom, is indigenous to Europe. There's quite simply no evidence to support it. One thing none of these guys actually bothered to do was check out what the ancient Greeks themselves had to say about this kykeon. Kykeon itself seems to refer to a number of different beverages of a similar type, including ones that did have intoxicating and medicinal effects, but most commonly it was a meal replacement, kind of like an ancient Greek soylent, and had a low-class connotation. We know from primary sources that the kykeon at Eleusis contained pennyroyal, which can have a slightly depressive effect when consumed in small doses, but it's far from entheogenic. Some scholars have suggested that opium, which was well known to the Greeks and even strongly associated with Demeter, may have been an ingredient, but there's no mention of it in the sources. Here's another daring possibility. Maybe, just maybe, the kykeon contained no mind-altering substances of any kind. I mean, this was a meal replacement beverage, after all, and it was consumed in the context of breaking a fast before a long ceremony. Moreover, after consuming the kykeon, initiates to the mysteries, who could number 2,000 or 3,000, lined up to get their names checked on the priest's attendance lists and finally enter the Telestrion. This process apparently took several hours. That's lousy set and setting, my friends. That is the exact opposite of chill. It's like when you drop a tab before heading into the movie theater, and then your friend is running late, so you have to hang out in like the parking lot for 30 minutes, and then by the time you come up to the ticket counter, you're like, 1 for pineapple. Please. I mean, isn't the most likely explanation for the mystical visions at Eleusis just like genuine religious exaltation? Maybe they were just feeling the spirit and loved them some Demeter. I don't know. It just seems like this post-1960s tendency to ascribe every mystical experience throughout history to psychedelics cheapens the depth and breadth of human spirituality. And I get the impulse. I've been to church. It sucks. I didn't see God there, but I did see her behind my eyelids on 5 dry grams in silent darkness. But that doesn't mean that entheogens are the only route to these hyperdimensional states, and states like them. Though Terence makes no hard claims regarding psychedelic explanations for the Eleusinian mysteries, he does frame them as the beating heart of the declining partnership model, and the last gasp of the Edenic mushroom cult of the Paleolithic, until their destruction by, quote, Christian barbarians in the wee centuries of the Common Era. The archaic mysteries were fading, and monotheistic patriarchy was ascendant. In Terence's words, the, quote, dark night of the planetary soul that we call Western civilization had begun. I think it's fair to say that I don't hold much stock in the stoned ape theory, although I hope I've demonstrated that Terence's theory of history is actually quite broader and richer than it's typically portrayed to be. But wait, there's more. The stoned ape theory is only half the tale. To truly understand Terence McKenna, we can't just talk about the beginning of human history. We need to grapple with its end, to take the monkey and put him in a starship. In La Chorrera, Terence had seen UFOs and felt alien presences. He had also been convinced that some sort of apocalyptic reckoning, some species or planetary transformation, was at hand. In some dreamlike way, he understood that the I Ching, an ancient Chinese divination tool, was the key to understanding these revelations. When he began studying the I Ching in the early 70s, he was struck by the coincidence of its 64-part structure having relevance to certain important moments in his own young life. His mother's death occurred 64 days before he met Eve in Colombia, with whom he would begin a long romantic relationship. His 25th birthday occurred 64 days after that. Extrapolating from fractal patterns he discovered, or thought he discovered, in the I Ching, Terence developed a formal mathematical structure of divination, which he called time wave theory, based upon the ingression of novelty into the human story. Believing that the universe itself is essentially a machine for the generation of complexity, Terence believed that novelty, especially technological novelty, was exponentially increasing throughout human history, especially in the 20th century, and that it would eventually reach a point of critical mass, a transcendental moment, where the human species would become unrecognizable to itself. Based on the time wave theory, and especially the computer program he developed for it throughout the 1980s, he believed this history-ending singularity would occur on December 21st, 2012. But Terence's 2012 apocalypse would not look like a Roland Emmerich film. It wouldn't be destructive, any more than a birth is destructive. It would be liberatory. The final triumph of the partnership model over the dominator, the end of 10,000 years of pan-species neurosis. Terence foresaw the end of history, the end of culture, the revivification of the mushroom cult of old, an archaic revival which would return humanity to its Paleolithic Eden of Gaian symbiosis and transform it with a technological rapture that would propel us into a higher consciousness, either as a utopian, star-faring civilization or as digital ghosts who had transcended flesh and defeated death. It may seem utterly laughable to us today, but in the late 20th century, especially the 1990s, many smart and well-informed people were theorizing with a straight face about the imminent end of history. Terence's book, The Archaic Revival, a collection of interviews and essays in which he lays out his apocalyptic mushroom prophecy in detail, was published in 1991, the same year as the dissolution of the Soviet Union. For many Western intellectuals, this event was nothing less than a sign of the end times, though, of course, they themselves used more, shall we say, doctoral language than that. The 20th century, many believed, had been the story of a struggle for supremacy among the three great modern political systems: capitalism, communism, and fascism. Capitalism and communism had banded together to destroy fascism, then viciously turned on one another. After generations of competition, capitalism proved the more resilient system, and communism fell apart. Now, in the hip, modern 1990s, as the internet dawned and the space shuttle streaked toward the stars, liberal capitalism, humanity's final earthbound political and philosophical stage, would guide us all through the shimmering gates of the millennium. Except that didn't happen. The Kendall Roy of Saudi Arabia convinced a bunch of people to fly some airplanes into some buildings and single-handedly plunged the liberal West into upheaval, neurosis, and despair. Wars began. The most powerful government in the world became unprecedentedly authoritarian. The economy collapsed, and the great necromancer's fear and stupidity resurrected the shambling corpse of fascism. In the 90s, the internet was thought to be the most democratizing technology in the history of the world. The printing press times 1,000. Terence himself was an early enthusiast of all things digital, and the internet in particular. He was an early adopter of computer technology in the 1980s, and frequently brought up the Dawkinsian concept of memes in interviews and lectures. According to a 2000 article in Wired magazine, he spent up to 4 or 5 hours a day online. Wow, imagine that. How excessive. In The Archaic Revival, Terence wrote about what he saw as the great transcendental promise of the internet.
Suppose a way were found to integrate human and machine intelligence to create a culture in which humans and machines were psychologically indistinguishable. This would allow us to influence the dimensions of that interaction. If we're creating another dimension, it might as well be paradise.
Last time I gave a shit, I got fucked! Oh shit!
It's safe to say that the internet has failed to live up to its promise as a liberatory technology. In Terence's day, they used to call television sets idiot boxes and brain rotters. How quaint. Addictive, mind-numbing, hopelessly corporate, and ruthlessly surveilled, the internet has grown to become a sinister golem, animated by many of our worst impulses. The World Wide Web did not end the crisis of history. It was subsumed by it. That said, Terence also predicted that the internet would dissolve human social boundaries, and that it would provide community for the alienated and the disenfranchised. And even on my most pessimistic Ted Kaczynski kind of days, I have to admit that this is absolutely wonderfully true. Terence famously said, "Culture is not your friend." Some other late 20th century sages in the anarchist industrial band Atari Teenage Riot gleefully announced their intention to, quote, destroy 2,000 years of culture. Hasn't that begun to happen in just the best way? Nationalities are less important than they've been in 150 years. Toxic cultures and traditions, what Doug Stanhope called dead people's baggage, have eroded or been consciously discarded thanks to digital connectivity in ways that we haven't seen since the late 1960s. Binaries have given way to spectrums in ways that would have been incomprehensible to us at the time Terence was writing his books. Terence specifically said he believed that the internet would liberate LGBTQ people and weaken the boundaries between genders. Has this not come to pass, thanks to the activist potential of new media? Terence would have loved all this, I think. In the Archaic Revival, he advocated for what he called green consciousness, which was similar to the holistic Gaian theology of his hypothetical Paleolithic mushroom cult. The historical record was the story of a crisis brought on by omnivorous, land-clearing war-makers. He associated the dominator model with animals, the masculine, restlessness, and the yang. A feminizing of culture was necessary to bring humanity back to the more constructive partnership mindset, a, quote, plant-based view, which he associated with plants, stability, the feminine, inward contemplation, and the yin. Since he believed the dominator culture had originated with the male need to determine paternity and thus control the reproductive lives of women, a blurring of gender lines would become a necessary facet of his Archaic Revival. Regressive attempts to cling to culture and tradition, literally referred to online as the trad movement, are laughably impotent in comparison to these titanic progressive forces, and only serve as more evidence of internet-driven cultural erosion. Among this mighty company of reactionaries, you will find pro-Confederate Canadians, Nigerian neo-Nazis, Australian Odinists, Malaysians who fetishize the British monarchy, and the descendants of Boston Brahmins spreading the divine truth of the Holy See in Rome. How fabulously postmodern. Science fiction author William Gibson once described cyberspace as a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions. If language is a form of telepathy, and that I can describe an image, a scene, or a concept to you in words, and you can take that thing which originated in my mind and reconstitute it in yours, isn't the culture of the internet, in all its Baroque mimetic forms, a distinctly new and radically advanced form of that kind of pan-human clairvoyance? As we scroll social media, transfixed like Saruman over the Palantir in a state of catatonic monomania, are we not living in the psychedelic future of digital transcendence that Terence predicted? In his film 8th Grade, Bo Burnham placed the song Orinoco Flow by Enya, the one that goes sail away, sail away, sail away, over scenes of the protagonist getting lost in the cold, soft glow of Instagram. What is this but an altered state? An extraordinary journey to hyperspace that has become entirely mundane through repetition. The difference between a woman on the subway lost in a Reddit thread and an astonished black-eyed man speaking to God courtesy of 5 dry grams of albino penis envy is merely one of degree. I think of myself as a filmmaker, creating art for an audience. I also think of myself as human, but to you I am not human. I am a ghost in your machine. Those of you who meet me in person are sometimes disappointed, and not just because of my general boorishness and highly offensive odor. What really disappoints you about me is my humanity. You don't think of me as a fully realized individual, but as a collection of memes. From your perspective, as I stare at you through the screen, I might as well be a DMT elf. Andrew Rakich is a human being. Atun Shea is a creature of a Kabbalistic digital realm that you can encounter but never truly comprehend, for the simple reason that Atun Shea is merely a hallucination that you and I share. Atun Shea cannot be quantified because Atun Shea doesn't fully exist. Instead, Atun Shea is a hyperspatial projection that I have conjured and that you have animated with your values, your fears, your hopes, and your insecurities. The world didn't end in 2012, but it was around that time that our species did transcend, in a sense. Not into a post-historical utopia, but into a distinctly novel epoch of that history. An epoch not of the body, but of the mind. As we look forward into what may be the first truly transhumanist century, we must conclude that the future is psychedelic, because the future belongs to the mind. Again, Terence was literally wrong, but he was poetically right. Viewed critically, time wave theory is utter nonsense. The accuracy of Terence's more peripheral predictions can be attributed more to his keen perceptiveness and interest in futurism than anything else. I'm not bothering to approach this theory from a materialist perspective, because what would be the point? Terence himself explicitly rejected the bounds of rationalism when he was formulating it. Though the I Ching provided a mathematical basis for the time wave, ultimately Terence's millenarian prophecies come directly from the mushroom itself, as in, the mushroom revealed them to him. This is the central, animating idea of Terence's entire philosophy.
Under the influence of psilocybin, there is an experience of contact with a speaking entity. The ease with which psilocybin induces this phenomenon makes it, from the viewpoint of a materialist or reductionist rooted in the scientific tradition, almost miraculous. So I set out to study this phenomenon and determine for myself, was this a deeper level of the psyche that could appear, somehow autonomously, to be a resident other in the mind with whom one could have conversations? Was this the voice of Mother Nature, or was it an extraterrestrial intelligence? These may seem like wild hypotheses, but you have to understand that I was pushed to them by evidence, by experience.
The true identity of the logos within psilocybin oscillates across Terence's various theories, but one explanation stands out as his clear favorite. At the beginning of the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, he writes a monologue from the mushroom's perspective, based upon his own revelations.
I am old, older in thought than your species, which is itself 50 times older than your history. Though I have been on Earth for ages, I am from the stars. My home is no one planet, for many worlds scattered through the shining disk of the galaxy have conditions which allow my spores an opportunity for life. The mushroom which you see is the part of my body given to sex thrills and sunbathing. My true body is a fine network of fibers growing through the soil. My mycelial network is nearly immortal. Only the sudden toxification of a planet or the explosion of its parent star can wipe me out, by means impossible to explain because of certain misconceptions in your model of reality. All my mycelial networks in the galaxy are in hyperlight communication across space and time. The mycelial body is as fragile as a spider's web, but the collective hypermind and memory is a huge historical archive of the career of evolving intelligence on many worlds in our spiral star swarm.
Deep in Earth's past, 1 billion years ago or more, spores from interstellar space penetrated our atmosphere, landed on an utterly alien shore devoid of all other life, and began spreading into thin white mycelia. Then the mushroom waited patiently for sentient beings to come along, beings with whom the mushroom could create a symbiosis. Terence writes that he doesn't necessarily believe everything the mushroom tells him. Instead, he says he treats it as he would an eccentric friend. Nonetheless, by his own admission, he worships the mushroom. It's not just alien, it's sacred. It was there at the beginning, enhancing human psychic capacity, and it will be there at the end, ushering us into hyperspace. It separated us from other animals by giving us sapience, and soon it will guide our ascent into godhood. As a cinephile, I can't help but notice that this whole idea bears remarkable similarity to the plot of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the mushroom as monolith. All of Terence's ideas are here. Early hominids lifted out of the crudeness of biological imperatives by a god alien from the stars. The crisis of history passing in a literal blink of an eye. A mere footnote, its only relevance to the human story as the shock wave that precedes the eschaton. And then psychedelic infinity. The god alien returns to consummate its long-awaited symbiosis with the sapient species it helped create. Rapture, revelation, rebirth into something new, something powerful, something that will never die. Terence was 21 years old when 2001 first blazed across the silver screen in April 1968. Was this young, impressionable Berkeley hippie, already deeply fascinated by psychedelia, one of the countless young people who dropped acid and saw 2001 in the theater that spring? I'm willing to bet he was. And did this incredible cinematic experience, one of the greatest works of art of the 20th century, leave an indelible impact on his life and beliefs? I think it's pretty likely. My main problem with the mushroom as monolith idea is that, as Terence puts it in a 1999 interview, it puts humanity back on center stage. The most widespread human cultures and religions have traditionally singled our species out as special, divinely chosen. The universe literally revolves around us. 300 years of Enlightenment rationalism has challenged this long-held assumption. There is, in fact, absolutely no evidence to suggest that human beings are special or unique. Zoology and behavioral science increasingly teach us that there is no categorical difference between us and other animals. Astronomy and physics reveals more and more every day how utterly insignificant our place in the universe is. suggesting in the face of our current scientific understanding that we are exceptional, much less divinely chosen, is shockingly narcissistic. Terence's theories, particularly mushroom as monolith, saves our self-absorbed species from the despair of insignificance by giving us a New Age version of Genesis. The mushroom created us in its image, gave us dominion over the animals, etc., etc. Perhaps that's not entirely fair to say, since environmentalism and respect for nature was such a huge part of Terence's philosophy, but still, I am leery of any human-created theology that insists that humans are superior to everyone else. Like, of course a human would say that. Nonetheless, I think there is something profoundly human, in a good way, about the obsession with apocalypse, the anticipation of irrevocable transformation. Terence looked at late 20th century technological and cultural trends, observed that history seemed to be speeding up, and concluded that our species was on the cusp of an unprecedented new epoch. In that sense, I believe he was right. But many other apocalyptic prophets throughout history have also sensed adumbrations of similar concrescences, and many of them have also been right, from a certain point of view. How many little apocalypses has our species foreseen, in one way or another, from the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem in the 1st century to the climate catastrophe in the 21st? None of these little apocalypses has as yet been the capital B big one. Of course, it's the height of vanity for any apocalypse prophet to suggest that the big one is coming within their lifetime. Terence was not immune to this. He saw the propagation of Psilocybe cubensis as a kind of second Neolithic revolution, and as the propagator of the mushroom monolith, he cast himself in a central John the Baptist-esque role in the coming eschaton. We humans are conceited creatures. Our entire ideological history can be summed up by us making the personal political. Did you have a strong father figure growing up? You're probably a bit of an authoritarian, and likely religious. Had to fend for yourself your whole life? Anarcho-communist atheism may be for you. I submit that all apocalypse prophecies are ultimately a projection of the individual apocalypse that we all must face. And in one way that probably does make our species unique, that we are aware of from a very young age. The fact is, history is speeding up for every one of us, all the time. The concrescence is getting closer every day. We're racing toward it, and it can't be stopped. Make up whatever story you like to try to make sense of it. The end is near. For you, and you, and you. Terence McKenna died on April 3rd, 2000. Legend has it, the brain tumor that killed him was shaped like a mushroom.